I'm Lindsay Freeman. I'm the director of the Tech Law and Policy program at the Human Rights Center here at the law school. And today I'll be talking with Juan Andrés Guerrero-Saade, which I'm not getting the accent right, so I might refer to as Jags throughout. I'll give more of his background, but just to tell for those who don't know a little bit more about the Human Rights Center and specifically the Tech Law and Policy program. We deal with and look at issues at the intersection of technology and international criminal justice. So some of that is looking at how technology can be used to help criminal investigations and war crimes investigations. And on the other side of that, it's how we might use accountability processes to regulate the malicious use of technology. And that's kind of where the focus is for this specific project. We also do a few different activities. Some is research and more policy-based, and then some is case building and strategic litigation. So we work either independently or with external partners, often with partners, to build dossiers that we can give to prosecutors at the International Criminal Court or in national jurisdictions that have the principle of universal jurisdiction, which means they can try war crimes from other countries. One of the main projects we've been working on for over a year now is on Ukraine and looking at whether cyber attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure could be charged as war crimes. So we actually started before the full-scale invasion last February, looking at incidents that happened in the context of the armed conflict since 2014. And so when Russia did invade fully, we pulled a team together to monitor, document, and investigate what was happening in the cyber domain. We've already submitted what's called an Article 15 communication to the International Court and are very soon going to submit another. An Article 15 communication is a bit like an amicus brief. It's a provision of the Rome Statute that allows external parties to either give evidence to the prosecutor or also make recommendations of specific legal theories. What we're doing is a bit of both, because we are pushing for a very unprecedented case of saying that the existing laws apply to what's happening in the cyber domain, but also sharing evidence that we have gathered using all the digital evidence tools that we've been developing in our investigations lab and with the Berkeley Protocol on digital open source investigations. So that's a little bit of background, and through this project, I met Jags because we had submitted our first Article 15 communication last March, and a journalist, Andy Greenberg, had written an article about it in Wired about the communication, and Jags is on a show, a stream with some other colleagues in the cyber threat intelligence community where they talk about different issues, and they had seen the article and were talking about it. So I reached out to Jags on Twitter to see if he would talk to us about the case. And that was a huge opening, being very helpful to our case, because Jags then introduced us to a much wider group as well. He pulled together a group of colleagues who have been informally advising us throughout, which has been incredibly helpful to make sure that we're getting the technical aspects of this right and really understanding the technicalities. So today we'll be talking a bit about what's actually happening in Ukraine in the cyber domain, because it's something that hasn't gotten a ton of coverage in the mainstream media, and so a lot of people don't know exactly what's happening, and can talk a bit more about the case and where we see it going as well. But with that, I'm going to turn it to Jags. He is the Senior Director of SentinelLabs at SentinelOne. He has been a researcher and led research teams at Google and Kaspersky Labs in the past. He's also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and has done a lot of very, very cool things, two of which are built exhibits, I guess, at the International Spy Museum, Moonlight Maze, and one other on projects that he has worked on, and he has many years of experience hunting threat actors, and especially on nation-state threat actors in the cyber realm. So with that, thank you for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining and having the first time at Berkeley. So good to get to visit everyone. So did a very kind job of introducing me and my background. You were also very kind in general about how we met, seeing as some of the people on the stream were not as nice about the project as perhaps they should have been, which is kind of where, like, what set us off, I think, in the right course, sort of understanding that there was a genuine, intellectually honest attempt at doing something special here and giving us the opportunity to kind of help out. So for folks that are not as familiar, which I expect to be most folks, the InfoSec and threat intelligence community, for lack of a better term, it is very kind of cliquey in high school way in some ways, and we might not have all the respect in the world for the law or international policy, right? Because at some point it does feel like it doesn't quite intersect with what we do. Like you're dealing with espionage, a lot of it fueled by countries, a lot of cybercrime that we have attributed down to individuals, and at the end of the day, the applicability of the law or the enforcement of policies tends to feel very arbitrary in some ways. So it leaves technical operators with a sense that that the law and international policy and international relations are not things that they need to really be concerned with or respect or engage with. To some extent, I understand why, and it's these are very talented individuals, but it's a very small community, and as it is, there's only so much that you can influence. And then also, not until recently have we had genuine engagement from different governments, from intelligence communities around the world, from folks at the UN, folks at now at the ICC, and sort of the discussions that we've had. That is very new in a lot of ways. So I think we have to kind of turn a new page and become useful to fields that we're not necessarily as well aligned with. So I do appreciate the opportunity to do that, and I think a lot of the folks involved do as well. When it comes to Ukraine in particular, it's been a difficult situation in a variety of levels, right? Obviously you have a war, but even before the full-on invasion, it's not the most ideal situation to try to work in cybersecurity or threat intelligence. Think about it as a country that, former Soviet Republic, climbing out of that space, embracing technology in their own way, with not necessarily the best resources or support. And then all of a sudden we need to try to secure an entire country for which not only is there a potential attacker, but an attacker that has already shown their willingness to outplay their hand and observe no rules and no laws whatsoever, and has done so in repeated cases, but in such a way that almost lets standards slip gradually. So when you see the 2015, 2016 attempts to shut off the power, and a variety of attacks things like NotPetya, which are all meaningful in their own right, they happen in a sort of gradual sense that doesn't necessarily get the involvement of the West and the Western organizations and companies and so on to the extent that they should have, in order to then be able to secure this nation in the face of an actual invasion. And landing that on the most basic terms, they don't use legitimate Windows licenses. They don't pay for Photoshop. They have a bunch of cracked software. There's a bunch of outdated Windows XP, Windows 7 systems that haven't been updated in a year or more. And all of that isn't people's computers, it's the infrastructure of the country. It's every ministry, organization, things that people rely on, databases that people rely on. critical infrastructure that people rely on. And then all of a sudden you're tasked with this notion of defending this country. So we were starting kind of on a back foot. Before going too much into it, I guess, how familiar are folks really with any of what's been going on in cyber in Ukraine? Like, not at all. Anybody read Sandworm? Anyone? All right, so Andy wrote a book called Sandworm, which was kind of a nice encapsulation of some of what had been going on. The cyber attacks on Ukraine were not new with the invasion. Basically, you have at least 2 attempts to shut down the power in certain portions of Ukraine through cyber means, more and less sophisticated, but essentially we're talking about the sort of predilection and predisposition that the Russians seem to have for like meaningful dates. So like in certain meaningful moments in the years before, they would choose to just hack a substation or a series of substations and then try to shut the power down. They had actually tried to do a lot more damage than they actually were able to do in some ways, thanks to the systems being more outdated than they expected. So, take that for what it is. And there's another kind of attack, which one of the biggest mistakes in my career was to call it NotPetya, as I didn't think it was going to be that meaningful at the time. Like, we were just dealing with yet another cyber attack. It turned out to be the most costly and destructive cyber attack of all time. So I deeply regret the naming scheme. But really, it was meant to just clarify the fact that, again, inside baseball, another company came out with a blog saying that this looked like Petya, which was a kind of like malicious, like crimeware stuff that had been around forever. And our PR people started to latch onto that and talk to journalists about Petya. And the only way to get the point across that this really wasn't Petya was to put it in the name. But what's meaningful about it is what you have is a self-spreading worm doing destructive sort of data wiping across a series of systems all across Ukraine. And the way that they did it was, there's an application called MEDOC. Think of it as if the IRS basically forced everyone in the US to use TurboTax in order to file their taxes. They hacked TurboTax, for lack of sort of analogous, and used that to push this destructive wiper that was, we say it's wormable, it was self-spreading. And that's part of the sort of the key issue with NotPetya is you drop this thing that's meant to indiscriminately spread and destroy, and it manifested in the way of Durex not having, sort of Durex factories going down, and Merck and Maersk having all this. There were no Oreos for a while. Like there was so much damage across these random organizations because you have you drop this piece of malware in one place, and if you think about an organization, most of them have flat networks. So even though I hit your Ukrainian office, if it's the same network connected in Sweden, they're going to get hit by the same malware. So it just became this self-spreading kind of snowball of disaster with damage in the more than 1 billion plus. A lot of folks in the West took that as testing, and I think that sort of speaks to our view of we're the center of the world, and whatever happens in the periphery is just something that might affect us someday, right? It doesn't matter until they hit the U.S. In reality, I think what we learned with the invasion is that they weren't testing anything. They were doing live fire exercises. They were hitting their target and seeing how things would go, and then when the time came, they just ramped up the exact same thing. They didn't really change their tactics drastically. When the invasion comes around, you get into a very different situation. The intelligence community had already been warning the Ukrainians that this was going to happen, and to be honest, it didn't seem like they really thought it was going to be the case until fairly late in, which meant that even though there was a great deal of goodwill and support, we weren't really able to reshape the ground in Ukraine. Instead, we were just kind of hoping to apply patches and salves and hacks and things around it to try to make it a harder target, even though what I described to you already is effectively Swiss cheese, right? Like there are holes everywhere, they're gonna be able to get in anywhere. So the question was, what role can cyber actually play? If you look at US doctrine around cyber, or Five Eyes in general, there is this idea of cyber as a fifth domain of warfare in which you can accomplish a great deal, and you can be very structured in your thinking about weaponry and attacks and disruptive attacks, and doing very special things to very specialized systems. However, that hasn't really been played out anywhere in any visible fashion. There have been elements of cyber in all kinds of conflicts, and some really meaningful operations by states, like things like Stuxnet that everybody thinks about, but we really haven't seen an all-out war supported by cyber, right? You have things in Afghanistan and Iraq, you have aspects of, even back in like Desert Storm, where okay, well there was some influence of cyber and electronic warfare, but this invasion is the first time that we see cyber as a true aspect of these operations. And it isn't coming from the most developed actors in cyber, like any of the Five Eyes nations or Israel or so on, but rather the Russians, where, as many of you may have noticed, it turns out they're not the most organized, the most self-aware military on earth, right? There's an expectation and there's a reality. It turns out the reality falls very, very, very far short of the expectation. It doesn't mean that they aren't a problem, obviously, but when you talk about something like cyber, it's not the same as packing bombs. You don't just get to say, we are gonna have a predictable effect in this predictable area, in this predictable way, particularly when it comes to war and your target shifts, right? Tomorrow, the Ukrainians change what systems they're using. The next day, the Russians bombed a power plant, and the target that you were hoping to hit in 2 weeks is no longer online. The person that was supposed to check the email that was supposed to let you into this important ministry, well, died. He hasn't been checking his emails, right? Things change, and it's not the same kinetic effects as just dropping a bomb or putting a warship here, or influencing by putting a battalion there. The physics of the space themselves change in unpredictable fashions. So we had expectations, and I say we, sort of the academics, the pundits, the policy people, everyone had expectations about what cyber war would look like. And then within days, we were arguing with ourselves about how far short this had fallen of what some random person expected, what the other person had hoped, what we had envisioned. But I think in reality, what we have here is the first test case of seeing what happens when cyber, when the rubber meets the road and it doesn't work the way you think it will. And the systems go down and the systems change, and people adapt, and Microsoft starts changing things for you that you don't expect. And it turns out that there's Western intelligence agencies that are taking down infrastructure and they're not telling anybody. And the internet is not like, physical matter. The internet doesn't exist. You have to remember this. The internet does not exist. The internet is a lovely name put over a patchwork of academic institutions, private companies, servers owned by some random dude, somebody who lives on a farm and supports this piece of software that you've never heard of, that if it went down, half of the internet would stop working. It's a patchwork. And it means that you have this series of spectators that can put a hand in a conflict who would never have the opportunity to in a war, right? Like, I can just choose to, well, in theory, right? Let's say that I am an internet service provider. I run an important wire, juncture, or whatever, where the internet flows towards Russia. Maybe tomorrow I decide, I'm really sympathetic with the Ukrainians. I'm just going to shut the internet down to half of Russia. That's not a nation-state action. That's not a UN action. That's just, I own this company. That infrastructure is mine. And as of tomorrow, I'm cutting you off. That applies to layers upon layers upon layers of services, servers, infrastructure, service providers, and it goes in both directions. There are people who have leaned weigh in to trying to help. And there are people who shine by their absence, as we say in Spanish, who just decided to not do anything. And that's the space in which you're trying to apply government policies, you're trying to apply soft power, you're trying to do law enforcement, you're trying, and there's a very unpredictable factor to it all. So, to establish a bit of ground truth, because I think I maybe ranted a little longer than expected, what we saw was about 12 hours before the actual physical invasion of Ukraine, we saw the first in a series of wiper attacks. When we say wipers, we mean something that's just, think of a ransomware attack, something that's just meant to kind of execute on your computer, but instead of encrypting and locking your files away, they're just deleting everything. And the point of it is to not just delete the data, but to make the systems inoperable. And not just to do it on one computer, but to do it on hundreds or thousands or across an entire organization. Meaningfully, different to NotPetya, they've learned some things, none of these wipers have been self-spreading, which lets you know that, well, first of all, the Russians had access to those networks ahead of time, and they knew more or less what they were going to hit, how. That does not make them masters of the universe, though. There was a certain level of opportunism, and that's something that really applies to cyber. Some targets are actually hard, some things aren't online when you expect them to be. But in any case, you have what we called hermetic wiper at the time being deployed across what at first we thought was just a couple of banks, and then it turns out it's a couple of banks, a couple of government organizations, and then there's also telcos. It turns out that it was pretty much everywhere. They were just trying to wipe all these systems in the process of starting this physical invasion. But we find out later what was actually happening at the same time is what has come to be known as the Viasat hack, which is a really unfortunate name, as we were discussing today, because, I mean, Viasat itself didn't get hacked. It's just, Viasat is a satellite provider. They buy a company called Eutelsat, which is also a satellite provider, but more relevant to Europe and the Middle East. Eutelsat operates the Ka-sat band, which when you think about satellites, it's sort of like their coverage basically rains down over a whole area of the globe, which in this case includes Ukraine. One of the many meaningful attacks, maybe one of the most meaningful attacks of the Ukrainian invasion was the use of a wiper that we called acid rain, pushed out to all of the modems that were being supported by this Ka-sat band. We now understand that their intention was to take down Ukrainian military communications. Think of these little modems, like even, they've been at some points used by Cyber Command and other aspects of like the US military and others. You're in the middle of nowhere, you need internet, you plop this thing down with an antenna, you now have internet. The Ukrainians apparently, because they will not confirm anything to do with losses or technical issues, anything like that, but apparently the Ukrainians relied on these satellite bands for field communications and possibly, in some cases, for control of their drones. This has not been confirmed. And then out of nowhere, you get this wiper and a more complex attack that essentially disables the internet entirely for these units. Eventually, Elon comes to save the day, and Starlink becomes a critical part of its infrastructure. You can say whatever you want about Elon, but at least on that part, that was a pretty good move. That's something that the Ukrainians go to rely on. But you can see sort of the strategy. There's this notion of cyber not as supportive command the way that we expect in the West, but as part of this strategy of general chaos. What if things that you implicitly relied upon suddenly go away? This thing no longer works. That website's no longer up. We lost the database of people who might have been conscripts the next day, people who may have the right to leave or come into the country. All these critical systems will suddenly just vanish, ideally all at the same time. That isn't meant to be a tactical support, but rather to be a general destabilization that comes along with troops suddenly rushing the border and all of the awfulness of war, but also the hilarious inadequacies of Russian military at the same time. over the next few months, sort of to cut a very long story slightly short, what we end up seeing is close to 14 or 15 different types of wipers, which is a pretty big proliferation of tooling on their side. A lot of it is not great, but it is meant to have the effect that it does. And then you have another type of meaningful attack, which is, apart from acid rain and the satellite stuff, is the return of Indestroyer, which it's a new or curtailed version of the malware that they used to try to take down the power substations a few years before. They tried it again. This time around, CertUA and Microsoft and ESET and I want to say Ucrnegro, one of the power companies, were on the lookout and essentially were able to stop the attack before it really went down. But looking ahead about a month after that, you can see how important it was to them to start messing with power generation. So okay, cyber didn't work, just start shooting missiles at substations. I paint all of that, or bring all of that forward, not just as a series of sort of sporadic observations, but rather to hopefully influence how you see the role of cyber in war, particularly in non-Western-led war. Because it isn't, like there's that expression about like a solution of a physics problem is a spherical horse in a vacuum. Like that's what we keep expecting. Everything's, all the conditions are perfect, the internet's up, the target's just there waiting for us, and our tooling is perfect, and we throw it at it, and everything goes precisely according to plan. Maybe that'll happen when, you know, it's American magicians on one side, but it turns out that when it's the Russians or the Chinese or whomever, that isn't how it plays out. It also doesn't take into account that asymmetry of actors that we were talking about. The Dutch are playing, the Swiss are playing, the Brits are playing, the Americans are playing. There's people in the middle who control important routes of the internet decided to play. Microsoft decided to give away a bunch of free services and put an army of 100 researchers to just monitor every system in Ukraine all day. And the Ukrainians gave them permission to alter settings on their machines and do what they needed to do. So all of that planning the Russians may or may not have done is suddenly occurring in a space that's fighting back and not working the way it was supposed to. And, so I think all of that is very meaningful and hopefully injecting a sense of realism into what it can be and what it actually is. And then hopefully that helps us manage our own expectations before writing our own op-eds on the New York Times about how like cyber war doesn't work, or this thing didn't exist, or this thing never happened, or no, we do not have a good picture of what's going on. And when I say we, I mean all of us, like the whole of the space, including the intelligence community and the private sector. What we are seeing are the sparse flashes of activity, and we're trying our best to understand what's going on. But just one last note about cyber attacks. They're very different than any kind of physical attack, particularly in that the victim doesn't necessarily know anything happened. With a wiper, sure, it's meant to disable something. So the disruption lets you know that someone was in the systems and someone altered something. But if you don't take that express step, which takes effort and volition and intention and tooling, then you don't know that someone's in your systems. The Russians could have been in the targets of Hermetic Wiper for 6 months, a year, and no one would have known. Unless someone looked, unless there was a security solution there that happened to fire on something, unless there was some mistake they made that let somebody know that they were there. So it's just to say that there's nothing inherent in an attack that lets the victim or external observers know that it's happening. A lot of our telemetry comes in a sort of incidental fashion. And you need to really keep that in mind when we have discussions about the breadth of cyber activity in this conflict. I will bet you we know maybe 20% of what's happened. And that's being gracious, that's being, charitable. We don't know how many groups are actually there. We don't know how many countries are operating there. We've seen indications that the Chinese ramped up their activity drastically, both in Ukraine and Russia, presumably to figure out what was actually happening as opposed to what the Russians were saying was happening. There has to be Western activity in and around the country, and in parts of Russia as well. I mean, they wouldn't be doing their jobs right if they weren't spying on these folks and trying to figure some of this stuff out. There's a lot that's happening in a covert fashion. If anything, the one change in all of this is the amount of loud, effects-driven operations that let us know that they're there. But that is just the tip of a very, very large iceberg of cyber activity that is relevant to the policy making, the legal frameworks, the incursions, the amount of support people are getting, the amount of investment they're going to get from one side and the other. So just think of cyber as kind of permeating this whole thing in a way that we really can't measure, and trying to figure out how to design frameworks and policies and put our hands in things in a way that will actually be meaningful. So with that, way too long rant.
No, that was great, and that was perfect, and actually kind of sets up, I can give you guys a little bit more background on how a lot of that translates into what we've been trying to do, or basically the task has been, how do we take that and translate that and fit it into a legal framework that we know and understand. And especially with all that activity going on, not all of that is going to constitute war crimes. So where is the red line? Where do you draw that? What actually constitutes an attack? Which is kind of a threshold that you have to meet when charging something as a war crime. So to give you more background on some of the incidents that were referenced here, our first submission to the ICC focused on the 2015 and 2016 power grid attacks. And we chose those as a test case for this idea that, you know, the laws of armed conflict can apply in the cyber domain for a few reasons. One was that we had the ongoing armed conflict, and when you talk to Ukrainians, for all Ukrainians, the war did not start last year. It's been going on for 8 years, 9 years now, that they've been defending against a Russian occupier in the country. So we already had a kinetic armed conflict, so didn't have to deal with the issue of, is a cyber attack alone going to start a war? Is that going to constitute an armed conflict? Because we already established the armed conflict. We also had a situation where you had a physical effect. In both of those attacks, the power went out, so it actually affected civilians, and a very large number of civilians at that. So that seemed quite compelling as something to look at, and also less legally contentious in terms of it looks a lot more like the types of harms that lawyers are familiar with. And also, we chose it because attribution at the stage we were looking at it was very, very strong down to the individuals involved in the attack. So I think it was in the summer of 2021 is when the US government, CISA, so it's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, I think, changed their alert for the 2015 and 2016 attacks, and they just made this change to move it up to high confidence in terms of it being attributed to the Russian government. And how the US government, they actually have a handbook that tells you how they look at things, and high confidence to them means beyond reasonable doubt. So from a legal standard, that sort of confirmed for us that there was very strong evidence that existed, that established attribution, and also between the Mueller indictment and another Department of Justice indictment against 6 Russian hackers who were involved in several of these attacks, we had the names of a lot of individuals which showed, okay, this is possible to do, and the evidence exists for these attacks as well. For the 2017 attack of NotPetya, which Jags was discussing, which still to today is the most devastating cyber attack in terms of economic harm. I think they estimate over $10 billion worth of damage, but it stopped the operations of biopharmaceutical companies, among many, many other things that it had sort of a real world effect. And we debated whether or not to include that in the first submission. We ended up not including it, but more for practical reasons dealing with the International Criminal Court, which is the harm caused by NotPetya occurred in 65 different countries. It was a much more complex attack, and when we're dealing with judges who don't know about technology at all, keeping it simple is key. But also NotPetya stopped or disrupted the services of 60 healthcare facilities in Pennsylvania. The US was one that had a lot of evidence, and the US does not get along well with the International Criminal Court. So getting that evidence and just lack of cooperation we thought would be an issue, so keeping it more finite between these two Ukraine attacks would be good. At the same time, though, the International Criminal Court has a gravity requirement, which means it has to be a serious enough damage for the ICC prosecutor to want to take it on, because he's, of course, balancing that with a bunch of different things happening across the world, and unfortunately, there are tons of mass atrocities going on and unfolding at the same time, and he has to select cases out of that. So that calculus, though, changed quite a bit when Russia invaded, because suddenly the ICC prosecutor opened the investigation into Ukraine, world attention was on it, and the US's sort of outlook towards the ICC has changed a lot. Some of that is because the administration that it's under, but some of it is just the US government has recognized Russia as more of a national security threat than the ICC, which they were seen as a threat to US national security before this. So we decided to add NotPetya, so in terms of the charges under the Rome Statute, in order for it to constitute a crime, you have to actually find a specific provision, look at the elements that you need to prove. So the two power grid attacks were attacks on civilian objects, which is not allowed during armed conflict. For NotPetya, we saw it more as an indiscriminate attack. It wasn't as clear cut that the target, since it was government websites, didn't have any sort of military advantage, and so the indiscriminate nature was what was at issue there. Similarly, the Viasat hack, which was the satellite attack that happened at the same time troops are crossing over the border, also was indiscriminate in nature. So the target was cutting off Ukrainian military communications. So that would be seen as a legitimate military target under international humanitarian law. However, they took out all the modems, as Jags explained, and so it took out internet for a much wider array, and it wasn't limited to Ukraine. So internet services in Greece, Italy, Poland, Germany, France, like a ton of different countries went down. It disrupted wind turbines in Germany. It disrupted emergency services in France. So it had all these other effects. So it wasn't self-spreading the way that the NotPetya attack was, but still indiscriminate in nature. And that sort of means once they deployed the malware, acid rain, the wipers, and put it out there, it can't distinguish between what's a civilian object and what's a military objective. And so that's how the indiscriminate attack is defined. And then in April, there was another use of InDestroyer and another sort of attempted attack on the power grid. It's been quite tricky to find out, the actual information that's going on, as you mentioned, and that's one where at first the Ukrainians came out and said it wasn't successful, and they didn't actually disrupt the power. Then things leaked that said it had, and we've gone back and forth with different information. So this comes into the investigation part of it, is trying to verify and vet the information to see what actually happened, and also whether or not that power grid was a legitimate military target. Was it supporting military activities, or was it something that was purely civilian? So those two attacks are other ones that we have added to this new complaint that we're going to submit to the ICC. So we have 3 attacks on civilian objects, 2 indiscriminate attacks, and then also, as we have seen the conflict moving into winter, we have seen kinetic attacks increase against the energy sector, but also food and agriculture, water infrastructure, transportation of humanitarian goods, and very similar targeting from the cyber side of things. So we don't think there's enough to say necessarily that there's coordination, which is something that Microsoft put out as a conclusion in their report, but definitely very similar targets in their massive missile strike campaign and what we're now referring to as the winter cyber offensive in these particular targets. So even if a lot of the activity didn't raise to the level of an attack, it was things like being in the system, they haven't done anything yet, but you can see that they've infiltrated, this nuclear power plant, taking all that activity to show the intent of the war crime of starvation, which is defined as depriving the civilian population of objects indispensable to their survival. So by targeting food, targeting water, targeting energy, it shows they're using starvation, especially with the timing going into winter, to sort of see this resurrection of activity after there was a lull for a bit. And we think the cyber aspect of it really helps show the intent of the perpetrators. Because if you have a missile attack, you can say, I didn't actually mean to hit that nuclear power plant. There was a legitimate military target nearby, and that defense works often, and they're able to say that. But you don't accidentally hack into a nuclear power plant without really knowing that you're doing it. So it shows the intentionality, which is something that's often very hard to prove with war crimes. So that's been another really interesting thing as well. And just going back and forth and having the conversations on how we translate what actually is happening on the ground into one evidence that we can get that establishes it. And so on that point, you've mentioned telemetry, which is a key piece of evidence for us, or for you guys in knowing what's going on. We kind of are relying on the translation of cybersecurity researchers to translate that data and let us know what it means. But can you talk a bit about what telemetry is and how you get visibility and who has visibility into what?
Sure. So that's actually a kind of a complicated aspect of these investigations in a variety of ways. So malware and any kind of cyber attack or operation, espionage, etc., it's not just by design meant to be covert, but also systems have been designed to be discrete. Before, when we first started, building computers, they had such limited capacity that you did one overt thing in the hopes of getting one result. Right now, if you look at the way that any of your computers work, even your phones, the most basic systems, they're doing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of operations at a second just to show you a window that gets dragged across the screen, or to play a video. That's just the way that computers have evolved. They do so much more, but they have been designed to do so much more discreetly. So most users don't know the amount of math and memory operations and stuff that happens just so that you can watch a YouTube video. In a way, that's made technology so accessible to a wider audience, but it also has made it that much harder to be aware of what all is happening in the background. To what extent is your machine doing 95% legitimate operations that you're asking it to do, and 5% working in the interests of a remote attacker that's collecting everything you do, or very interested in where you are, or siphoning off all the information from your organization, and so on. So when we talk about telemetry, what we mean is, depending on the system and on the visibility possible, how much of this material is being collected to be able to reconstruct what's happening on a system. Think of it like a black box on a plane, right? There's all this telemetry, there's all this information about what's happening to the plane, the conversation between the pilots, the status of all the systems, all being put into this box. And God forbid the plane goes down, you have something to go pick up and go, okay, what was happening? Was there a system that was wrong? Were the pilots discussing how choppy the flight was? Was there, did something stop working? There's a similar mentality to it in the security space, but there's nothing inherent in the systems that creates that. You have to overtly put that functionality in. So for example, when it comes to endpoints, so laptops, servers, whatever computers you're using, usually that telemetry is being generated by one of two things. More common thing is you have an antivirus, an EDR, an endpoint detection response software, XDR, whatever it is that you want to call it. There's a piece of software that's supposed to serve as a sentinel or a guard or someone overlooking the operations of your machine, going, is this a legitimate thing or not? Is this something that you've allowed or not? Is this something that we think is bad or not? And in the process, it's generating information about what the machine does and putting it somewhere that other people can look. The other similar system is your operating system. Primarily, if you're on a Windows machine, Microsoft collects a great deal of information about what that system does. They anonymize it, they do all kinds of things to it, but they actually collect quite a bit of information about what your system is doing, mostly for the sake of security. Like, you can get into sort of this panopticon panic, but frankly, you're all giving away far more information than you think you are to a lot of other people. So like, that's not where you should start. Let's be honest. So that is one aspect of it. The other aspect is on the network side. Like there's, what does your internet service provider collect along the way? What do the DNS servers, which are like, think of it as like the map of the internet that you consult every time that you want to go to a website. What is that collecting? What about the firewalls and all of the hardware stack inside of Berkeley? Surely there's an IT team here. Maybe they're really good, maybe they're not that good. I don't know, but they have a bunch of systems that are collecting telemetry on, who contacts what system contacted what website at any given moment. So that is how you get all these different collections of quote unquote telemetry in all these different places that you can then mine for indications of badness, or more importantly, to reconstruct how an attack might have happened at any given moment. The real complication there is, fine, A, was there something generating telemetry? And then B, who then owns that telemetry? And that's where you get into a much crummier side of this, which is, if Google owns the telemetry of everything that happened to your email account, do they have any obligation to share it, to enforce based on it, to give it to you, to give it to someone else? I call out Google because I like to call out Google a lot, but let's say they do this thing now where they put up little banners and they say, hey, you are being targeted by a nation state hacking crew, like you've been the target of whatever. Try to find out from them who, why, like what email, what infrastructure, what IP domain, what email did I get that made me a target for whom? That's not your information, that's their information, and they're not going to give it to you. So that applies to how a lot of these investigations are being carried out right now, where you have some companies that have leaned way in. Microsoft, Mandiant, ESET, us at SentinelOne, a bunch of government organizations, a lot of us just basically trying to put our cards on the table saying, look, this is more important. We're not here to institute IP claims. You know, it's not about intellectual property. It's not about my telemetry versus your telemetry. We all are going to put our pieces together to try to figure this out. And then you have a series of players who just decided that they can't be bothered, that they don't have the resources, that they don't want the legal sort of toxicity of dealing with PII, maybe leaving the door, maybe they don't want to deal with the fallout of taking sides in this war. Maybe that seems obtuse in this case, but try to have the same mental exercise when it comes to the Chinese and how much they control, let's say, the manufacturing of iPhones, and whether Apple has an incentive to let you know when they're targeting Uyghurs using iOS 0 days for ongoing genocide that we don't quite have the mental real estate for right now, right? Not to be trivial about, but that's how these companies sort of function. So when we talk about these incidents, we're in a kind of complicated situation where the hard part was even figuring out that it was there, and then how did it happen, and who did it. But then you also have very sparse pieces about what constitutes the whole of the operation. So I have aspects of what of the malware sort of asset rain that was used in Viasat. However, Mandiant is bound to have way more information because Mandiant got hired to do the incident response after the hack. Why has Mandiant not said anything? Well, part of an incident response report is you sign an NDA, and that information belongs to the client, and the client is Viasat. Viasat has to decide whether they're going to disclose the particulars of this hack with the public or with the government or with anybody. And God forbid they have any kind of litigation or there's any kind of, claims of responsibility or potential regulatory problems. What incentive does that company have to then come out and say, look, these are all the ways that things went wrong for the sake of something else, an entirely different, unrelated initiative? Similarly, when we talk about all the wipers, we know of a variety of wipers. We've investigated a ton of them, reverse engineered them, understood where they're coming from, what they're doing. In most cases, we don't know who the victims are. When it comes to a wiper attack, it can be something as trivial as they took the website down for the local movie theater, or they deleted a database of Holocaust survivors, or some kind of aspect of Ukrainian genealogy, history, culture that can never be recreated. Same malware, same type of operation, very different gravitas when it comes to the effect that it has. But we don't know a lot of the victims. And in many cases, the only people who know are the Ukrainians, and they have an imperative to not show their hand when their attackers are hitting the right targets or the wrong targets. So there is an information asymmetry that plays an important role here that we're trying to almost fight against, and figure out where we have solid ground to say, look, this happened in this way and included these things. And I think there's enough baked into it where, particularly with the attacks on electric substations, okay, you had to build a specialized tool that works particularly, that speaks the language of electric substations. You can't say that you accidentally created that and accidentally deployed it in the right place by accident, and you didn't really mean to take down the power, as opposed to the missile where it just landed in the wrong place. So there are aspects of this that are much more, that lend themselves much better to these investigations, and there are aspects of it where you think you should have the information, you actually don't. And that's kind of where we're playing at right now.
Great. I'm going to open it up to audience questions, but just one final thing on that. The fact that the private sector has so much ownership of valuable information and evidence is a very interesting dynamic for an international criminal investigation, where usually you're very reliant on states, or the ICC would be reliant on state cooperation, but state cooperation is always inherently political. So there are a lot of issues with that. So while the private sector, they don't have to give it over, there's no, imperative to, you also don't have the same politics, and there might be reasons that they want to or they want to help this effort. So this has been something that we've been navigating, actually talking to the private companies and the Ukrainians and trying to get this information. And in some ways for the ICC, it might be beneficial because they have a difficult relationship with the United States, but they don't have a difficult relationship with Microsoft. They actually have a very good relationship with Microsoft. So it's just a very, very interesting dynamic in how the private sector is playing into this and just the types of evidence in these